Thank you, Julia, for the very warm and kind welcome. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land on which we gather today. I'd like to pay respects to their elders, past and present. Just on that, I don't want to just skip over that. Last week I spent some time up in the Kimberleys with the Kimberley Land Council at their 40th anniversary, and the importance of the old people in the struggles that they have undertaken, the confrontation at Nukumba that led to the formation of the Kimberley Lands Council that drove land rights in the Kimberleys, is absolutely an important part of our history. And so when I say I acknowledge the elders, for me at the moment that's a very poignant thing to do, because I'm only here and we're only here because of the work that they've done. So I really want to acknowledge the elders of this country. I also want to bring greetings from my own peoples, as Julia said, the Quandamooka peoples from Minjerribah. And again, I want to thank the Fabians for inviting me to talk tonight. What I want to do tonight is rather than lecture, I'd rather tell you a story. It's a story that my Quandamooka ancestors and generations of other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been talking about for more than 200 years. This story is not my own, and nor is it new. It's a really, really old story, but it's a story whose time has come. And it's the story of the Uluru Statement from the heart. I'll get this, hang on. This statement speaks to me because I was very closely involved in its creation, as Julia hinted. My signature is etched into its canvas as I knelt in the red soil of Mutijulu on the 26th of May 2017. I remember that moment for many reasons. The wonder at seeing the yellow-clad gumach and the blues and the greens of the Torres Strait dancers kicking up clouds of red on Anangu land. I remember the looks on people's faces and the camaraderie of people who only hours before that moment had brought the statement to life. But most of all, the thing I remember most about that moment is how weary I felt. In this moment of triumph for my peoples and my nation, I felt a tiredness in my bones and in my soul. I was absolutely and utterly spent. And I remember sitting there at the time thinking there's something wrong. I should be joyous and full of energy and on top of the world because of what we just created. But then I took a moment to myself to remind myself of what it had actually taken to get to this point. So I had worked with the Referendum Council as it held 13 regional dialogues with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across the country, led by Arnie Anderson, Professor Megan Davis and Noel Pearson. It was the most comprehensive process ever to engage Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the hard business of constitutional reform and structural reform. My job was to capture the stories as more than 1,200 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people gave their hearts and their minds to the dialogues. Standing at the front of the room at each of the dialogues, I heard up here, but also felt the passion, the grief, the hope, the challenges, and the ideas from peoples who had spent decades striving for change. I remember the tension of helping shape the agenda and co-facilitating the Uluru Convention. Thinking on the night before we started that all the work that we'd done up until that point, and Justin will talk in a minute about the decades and decades of work that had happened before that, and thinking that all of that was coming to a head. Knowing that more than 250 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples were gathering nearby and preparing themselves for the hard work of reaching a consensus over those next 3 days, and having absolutely no idea about what that consensus would be. On the final morning of the convention, Megan read the statement for the very first time. I was churning with different emotions. I had pride in the work of all of our mob. I was nervous about what the reception would be like to that first reading of the statement, and I was just hanging on to every single word, feeling the tension ripple through the room. And I still get goosebumps just thinking about it now. It was a very real experience. So Megan finished the reading, and the response was more than 250 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people getting to their feet in spontaneous applause. It was an emphatic endorsement of this statement. It is a truly historic consensus and a compelling mandate for reform. So all of this weighed on me in that moment of exhaustion. And then I look up and I see Auntie Pat standing there with this look on her face. This just set it all for me. It shows a lifetime of dedication, of sacrifice, and of service to her nation. It shows that moment of triumph tinged with a sadness for those that did not live to see it. And it shows the determination to complete the job of weaving the ancient and modern identities of Australia into a more complete whole. In seeing this look on her face, it reminded me that comparatively to somebody like her, I've been on the scene for about 5 minutes. And in a strange way, that allowed me just to relax. I let the tiredness just slip off my shoulders, and I was able to enjoy that moment. But I also knew that the hard work was yet to come. If nothing else from this story, and if nothing else that you've heard from people who've talked about the Uluru Statement before, I really want you to understand this particular point. This statement is not a submission or a petition to the government. It is an invitation to you, the Australian people. So the statement commences. We, gathered at the 2017 National Constitutional Convention, coming from all points of the southern sky, make this statement from the heart. Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands, and possessed it under our own laws and customs. This, our ancestors did, according to the reckoning of our culture, from the creation, according to common law from time immemorial, and according to science more than 60,000 years ago. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion. The ancestral tie between the land, or Mother Nature, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom remain attached thereto, and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished, and coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. How could it be otherwise? That peoples possess the land for 60 millennia, and this ancient link disappears from world history in merely the last 200 years? With substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. So, a unanimous theme across the dialogues, across the country, if people always ask this evasive question, where are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples unified? When are they going to be unified? Well, they were absolutely unified in absolutely stating that their First Nations sovereignty has never ever been ceded. At Ross River, about 100 kilometres east of Alice Springs, with 3 interpreters in the room to take into account the different language groups, people talked about their jukapa, their unshakable connection to their past, present and future. It is their law and their way of life. They did not talk about sovereignty as an abstract political concept. In fact, they barely mentioned the word at all. Not because it is unimportant, but it is because it is so fundamental to who they are, it is impossible to imagine living a life without it. It has never been and will never be ceded. However, the statement goes beyond this notion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sovereignty alone. It does not regard it in isolation, but in coexistence with the sovereignty of the Crown. The fundamental reckoning of these two sovereignties is the settlement that has evaded us as a nation since 1788. In welcoming people to this year's Gama Festival up in northeast Arnhem Land, my brother and Gumach elder, Jawa Yunupingu, summed up this sentiment beautifully when he said, "You will hear us," when he was inviting people to the festival, "you will hear us singing tonight, and we will be singing to our ancestors, who are your ancestors too. We will be singing to remind them that we are here, maintaining our connection to them for their appreciation. And we do this not just for us, but for all of us. Because our sovereignty is not a hard and brutal sovereignty. It does not take from others. It does not exclude or steal. Our sovereignty is welcoming." The triumph of this statement is not the proposals it contains or even the consensus that it represents. It is that these words come from a place of deep love for each other as Australians and belief that we will seize this opportunity to reimagine and remake ourselves as a nation. This is the profound gift that the Uluru Statement gives to all of us. The statement continues, "Proportionally, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not an innately criminal people. Our children are aliened from their families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem. This is the torment of our powerlessness." It would be sadly very easy to rattle off a series of statistics that sit behind these words, but instead I'm going to explain the two elements that make these structural problems. These two elements have been on show in the first week of Parliament every year for the last 10 years in the tabling of the Closing the Gap report. This year, former Prime Minister Turnbull reported that only 3 out of 7 targets were on track to be met. These targets are aimed at reducing Indigenous disadvantage. The employment gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia is actually getting wider. The laws, the policies, the programs, the services to address these issues are not working. While there are some successes, and many of them driven by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and organisations, the current system needs comprehensive reform. This failure is the first element of the structural nature of our problem. The second element is harder to see, but is actually more pervasive. It is the lack of outrage that accompanies the systemic bipartisan failure. It is the surrender to the idea that the place of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples is and always will be at the bottom of the pile. It is the suggestion by the morning breakfast TV show panellists that maybe the stolen generations weren't such a bad thing after all. It is the stadiums booing Adam Goodes under the pretense that he fakes free kicks. It is the call for a voice to Parliament, the very carefully considered, grounded proposal for a voice to Parliament that is answered with the appointment of Tony Abbott as the Special Envoy on Indigenous Affairs. In response to these structural problems, the Uluru Statement proposes 3 structural reforms. The statement continues, "We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power of our destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk in 2 worlds and their culture will be a gift to their country. We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. We seek a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. The Voice to Parliament is the only proposal for constitutional reform and will require a vote of you, the Australian people, in a referendum to succeed. There are no silver bullets to the challenges facing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but we have consistently advocated for political representation and genuine empowerment and self-determination for decades. We know the solutions to these challenges will be more effective and more productive when we do have a proper say. The Voice to Parliament will not diminish the authority of the Parliament, but will enhance its effectiveness. It is fair to say it needs some help. In the 10 years of the Closing the Gap strategy, we have seen 6 Prime Ministers and 27 Premiers and Chief Ministers come and go. It is hard to take a generational view on issues like children and out-of-home care with that sort of disruption. We need the continuity and certainty of a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament so that critical decisions are informed by First Nations who are closest to the challenges. The constitutional protection is critical. We've seen many representative bodies and other bodies rise and fall over the years. They were all vulnerable to changes in the political climate, but the problems remain. Just putting a voice in legislation will be repeating the mistakes of the past, and I'll be back here in 20 years dusting off the same talk. We've heard a lot from the rejection of the Uluru Statement and the Referendum Council's report by former Prime Minister Turnbull, the characterisation of it as a third chamber, the mischaracterisation of it as a third chamber of the Parliament. Anybody who's read the statement in the Referendum Council's report would know that that is patently false. Unfortunately, the current Prime Minister, Morrison, repeated those sentiments today. So we know that that is a challenge that we have for us to advocate for this reform. There is another challenge that I want you in particular to understand. It is one thing to knock one side of the political spectrum. The other side needs some attention too. We've heard pretty strong indications that the appetite there is not for a constitutional enshrinement, but to put this in legislation, just like a normal representative body. You cannot say that you support the Uluru Statement from the heart and advocate that position. We did not ask for a legislative body, we asked for a constitutionally enshrined First Nations voice to the Parliament, and that is something we are not resiling from. A legislative body is not a win, it's not an incremental step. It is a dismissal of the Uluru Statement, and our mandate is, that we are sticking to that as part of our advocacy and as part of our conversations with the Australian people. The Voice will scrutinise policy and legislation and will improve the Parliament's ability to pass good laws about us. It will be a strong representative voice that will benefit not just the Parliament but the business and social sectors in ongoing reform. It is a pragmatic and productive proposal. The other structural reform proposed is the Makarrata Commission to lead to agreement making and truth-telling. Unlike the Voice to Parliament, it does not require a change to the Constitution, will not require a referendum. The Makarrata Commission will guide the process of settling the relationship between the sovereignty of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations and that of the Crown. It will establish a national treaty framework to give certainty and consistency across the country for a process of negotiations. The Makarrata Commission will also establish a truth-telling process about our nation's history. While we honour our involvement in foreign wars, we turn a blind eye to the frontier wars and the violence that heralded the British colonisation of this country. Some of our conflicts are more recent and our people have not forgotten. People at the Cairns dialogue remember the midnight raid by Queensland police at Mapoon in 1963, the forced removal of its residents and the burning of their homes to the ground. Truth-telling is not about apportioning blame or generating guilt. It is about the realisation that deep reconciliation in this country is impossible without also knowing and naming the truth of our shared history. The statement concludes, in 1967 we were counted, in 2017 we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country. We invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. So this is it. This is our moment to make our own history. One that acknowledges what has come before us and imagines a greater future. A future that connects us to each other through truth, love and belief, and one that binds us as a nation to this land and its story. The invitation is here, and it is our choice in this moment to decide what our legacy will be. Tell this story to others. Have a conversation about the promise of our shared identity. We're in the process of establishing a website called uluruforall.com. I encourage you to visit that once it's get up. You're not going to get much joy there at the moment, but we'll have that up soon. Write to your MPs, both state and federal, because they need your encouragement. They really do. And when you write to them, you tell them that you want your voice heard in a referendum as soon as possible. Let's just get this done. Side by side, let us walk together in a movement of the Australian people. Thank you.